Howdy folks, welcome to Live at the Lazy T Ranch. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Chris Wilson is doing the video. This is our Live at the Lazy T Ranch session, except for two things. Number one, we're not live, and number two, we're not at the Lazy T Ranch. We're actually on a trip to Texas to visit our daughter, so we're recording this session, but we're recording at her place in Fort Worth, Texas, where she's a veterinarian. This is our first trip out of Kansas since the pandemic started. We're being very careful. We're socially distancing. We're using masks, sanitizing, and basically self-isolating at our daughter's house. But since we are in Texas, it's a good opportunity to talk about Fort Worth, the Longhorn cattle, the Chisholm Trail, and really the origins of the cattle business. In honor of this topic, I'm wearing my Longhorn shirt tonight, so I'll turn around. Hope you got a good view of that Texas Longhorn on the back of my shirt, because that's really what our story is all about. We have to begin our story in 1865 when the Civil War came to an end. When the soldiers came back to Texas after the war, they found a couple of things. One, the Texas economy was in shambles. People had no money. The economy was in a really bad shape. And secondly, they found that the Longhorn cattle that they'd left behind had gotten out, gone free, multiplied in the wild. There were lots and lots of these Longhorn cattle running around free, but there was no market for them. They really had no value. However, there was demand for beef in the big cities back east. And an entrepreneur named Joseph McCoy had the idea of solving this problem, bringing those two things together. He was a livestock buyer from Springfield, Illinois. He came west, traveled down the Kansas Pacific Railroad to Abilene, Kansas, where he found a place he could build a stockyards and invite Texas cattlemen to bring their Longhorns north to Abilene, where they could get put on the railroad and shipped east to where the market demand was. And it worked very, very well. It was a huge success, and it was very significant for Texas as well as other segments of the cattle industry. The route that those cattle traveled from South Texas and through some feeder trails where they were gathered, and then north through Fort Worth, through Indian Territory, and Abilene, Kansas, would ultimately become known as the Chisholm Trail. And today, the International Chisholm Trail Association is working with some key senators and congressmen, I'm proud to say, from Kansas, who are promoting the notion that Congress should designate the Chisholm Trail as a National Historic Trail. And the Texas Longhorn is a great symbol of that trail. And it was very important to the state of Kansas. And to me, the Chisholm Trail represents this bond between Texas and Kansas that's always existed. That was long before the Big 12 Conference, right? But it was very important to the economy of Texas. And in Albany, Texas, exactly 125 miles due west of where we are in Fort Worth, an author named Berta Hart Nance wrote a poem that really saluted the importance of the cattle industry to the state of Texas. And the opening lines of that poem were, "Other states were carved or born, Texas grew from hide and horn." And it really is true, because it was the Texas Longhorns that saved the economy of Texas through the cattle drives. And then in later years, the huge stockyards in Fort Worth and in Kansas City and in Chicago became very significant. And then over time, the structure of the industry changed, and those stockyards really don't exist in those other cities. In Fort Worth, here in Fort Worth, they preserved those stockyards. They've converted it basically to an entertainment district, and they're honoring that history. And the stockyards are in fact a National Historic District. And one of the special things about the stockyards in Fort Worth is that every day of the year, except Easter, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, twice a day, they have a Longhorn cattle drive. They have a herd of Longhorn cattle, big Longhorns, some horns as long as the length of my arm, believe it or not, and they drive them down the streets of Fort Worth, the old stockyard district, and while visitors watch. And it's a fun thing to see. The only twice daily cattle drive anywhere in the world, as a matter of fact. So the Longhorn cattle were very important to Fort Worth, and in fact the city of Fort Worth has their official logo I want to show you. This is the official logo of the city of Fort Worth, which once again shows that Longhorn symbol. So the city of Fort Worth really appreciates the Longhorn cattle and that history today. When the Longhorn cattle got to Kansas, a couple of interesting things happened. Number one, those drovers found that they could pasture their cattle on the hills and the grasslands in Kansas even before they took them into market, and those cattle would fatten up. They found that the Flint Hills of Kansas were an ideal place to raise cattle, and it has proven true still today, and that's why the cattle industry is king in Kansas. The other thing they found, however, was that those Texas Longhorns, who were so well adapted to the heat and the humidity and the conditions of arid Texas, were not great at producing quality beef. And when the introduction of the British breeds, the French breeds, Hereford, Angus, and so forth, those were ideal for raising high quality beef. And today at the Lazy T Ranch, we're raising Hereford and Angus, black baldy crossbred calves, and those really are ideal for producing high quality beef today. But the history of the beef industry in many ways goes back to those Texas Longhorns and the days of the great cattle drive era when the legend of the cowboy came to life. Let me finish up this segment with this poem which I wrote as a tribute to those Longhorn cattle. It's called Horns, Hides, and Herds. Let's go back to the year of 1865 to learn of the origin of the great cattle drives. The Civil War had come to an end and soldiers returned to their families and friends. But while the men were gone to the war, you see, Longhorn cattle in Texas were ranging free. Texas buyers would pay only $4 a head for the beast, but those critters would bring $40 a head back east. So they gathered up those cattle and drove them up the Chisholm Trail to Kansas, where they could go east by rail. Those cattle had horns, sharp and strong, of course, which could kill an unwary cowboy or horse. Young cowboys were hired to make those rides and deliver their cattle for their beef and their hides. Young drovers saddled up and rode their horses forth and drove those huge herds of cattle north. Some 3 million head came to Kansas in that way and launched the legend of the cowboy, which we celebrate today. But the history of the West would not have earned those words without those Longhorn cattle and their horns, hides, and herds. Thanks, folks. So we're coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas tonight. Next week we'll be back at the Lazy T Ranch. So join us Tuesday, 1 o'clock. Share, comment, like. For now, be safe, be well, happy trails, and God bless.